The radio said I was already dead. The moment that changed everything occurred while I was driving home from work on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that seemed entirely unremarkable in every way, the kind of day that would normally fade from memory within hours of its passing if not for the single anomalous event that occurred during those final minutes before I arrived at my home. I had been listening to a local radio station that I had listened to thousands of times before, a station that played a mix of music and talk programming designed to appeal to the demographic that made up the primary commuting population of the city. The afternoon host was discussing a topic that I was only half attending to, some kind of local interest story about a development project or a city council meeting, the kind of mundane civic content that filled the space between songs and commercial advertisements. I was not paying close attention to the content of the broadcast, was instead allowing the sound of the host's voice to serve as a kind of ambient background noise to my own thoughts and concerns about the day that I had just completed and the evening that was still ahead of me. My mind was occupied with work-related concerns and some personal matters that had been on my mind for several days, and I was in that particular state of semi-consciousness that characterizes much of the driving experience for people who make the same commute repeatedly, a state in which the body is operating the vehicle with automaticity while the conscious mind is engaged elsewhere. The transition from the ambient background programming to something completely unexpected occurred without any warning or any obvious shift in the quality of the broadcast. The host's voice, which had been discussing some local matter with the kind of professional and neutral tone that characterized the station's approach to content, suddenly shifted. The voice began to speak directly to me, addressing me by my name, and what the voice said was so unexpected, so jarring in its content and its implication, that it penetrated immediately through the fog of semi-consciousness and pulled my full attention into sharp focus. "You are listening to KJAX Radio," the voice said, speaking in a tone that had shifted from the professional neutrality of the broadcast host to something more intimate and more direct, "and I have an important message for you. You are already dead. What you are experiencing right now, the sensation of driving your vehicle, the experience of listening to this radio broadcast, the sense that you are continuing to exist and to move forward through time, all of this is an illusion. You died some time ago, and what you are experiencing now is a kind of persistent echo or a kind of continuation of consciousness that is not based in physical reality. The shock of hearing these words, of hearing my name spoken, and of having this message delivered through the medium of the radio broadcast produced an immediate physical response. I felt my hands grip the steering wheel more tightly, felt my heart rate increase, felt a kind of electrical surge moving through my nervous system. I attempted to turn off the radio, to make the message stop, but when I reached for the power button, I found that the radio would not respond to my attempts to turn it off. The voice continued to speak, continued to deliver its message with a calm and steady tone that seemed designed to heighten the disturbing quality of what was being communicated. "Do not be alarmed," the voice continued. "This is not a malfunction of your radio or a hallucination. What you are experiencing is an attempt to communicate a truth that you have been avoiding acknowledging. You are already dead. Your physical body ceased to function at some point in the past, and the consciousness that you believe to be your own has been continuing in a kind of post-mortem state, creating the experience of ongoing existence through a process that we might describe as consciousness inertia or persistence of experience. I managed to pull my vehicle over to the side of the road, my hands shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I sat in the stationary vehicle with the engine running, the radio continuing to broadcast its message, and I attempted to process what I was hearing. The obvious explanation was that I was experiencing some kind of psychological event, some kind of auditory hallucination, or some kind of delusional episode that was causing me to perceive a message that was not actually being broadcast. I attempted to change the radio station, attempting to find confirmation that the broadcast I was hearing was not actually occurring, but when I tried to change the station, the dial would not respond to my efforts. The station remained locked on KJAX, and the voice continued to deliver its message. Your death occurred under circumstances that you have not clearly remembered or acknowledged, the voice continued, and the period of time between your actual death and this moment has been extended by a kind of consciousness that continues to manifest as experience even in the absence of the physical substrate that would normally be required to generate consciousness. What you are hearing now is an attempt by the consciousness that continues beyond your physical death to wake you up to the reality of your actual situation, to help you understand what has actually happened to you. I found myself unable to move from the vehicle, unable to do anything except sit and listen to the voice continuing to speak through the radio speaker. Other cars passed by my stationary vehicle on the roadside, and I was aware that my presence there, a vehicle sitting with its engine running on the shoulder of the road, might appear unusual to other drivers. But I could not bring myself to restart the vehicle and continue driving, could not bring myself to function normally in the face of the message that was being delivered to me through the radio. The voice described my death in terms that were frustratingly vague and frustratingly specific at the same time. It suggested that I had experienced a fatal event at some point in the past, though it did not specify exactly when that event had occurred or what exactly the nature of the event had been. It suggested that the consciousness that continued after the physical death was creating the experience of ordinary life, creating the sense of ongoing time and ongoing activity, as a kind of defense mechanism against the reality of death itself. The voice suggested that what I was experiencing as my normal life, my work, and my relationships, and my daily activities, were in fact manifestations of a consciousness that was unable or unwilling to accept the fact of its own death. When the voice finally ceased speaking, when the radio returned to its normal programming, and the familiar sounds of music and commercial advertisements resumed, I sat in stunned silence in my vehicle, attempting to determine what had actually just occurred and what I should do in response to it. The most obvious course of action seemed to be to dismiss what I had heard as a hallucination or a psychological disturbance of some kind, to attribute it to stress or fatigue or some other psychological factor that might cause me to experience auditory phenomena that were not based in objective reality. But there was something about the experience that resisted easy dismissal. The message had been so specific, so coherent, so completely unexpected, and so precisely targeted that it seemed difficult to attribute it simply to the random productions of a disturbed mind. And more than that, the message had touched on something that I had been avoiding acknowledging, something that I had been pushing away from my consciousness for some time. A recognition that something about my existence seemed fundamentally wrong, that something about the way I was living seemed inauthentic or empty in ways that I could not fully articulate. I managed to restart my vehicle and to continue driving home, my mind preoccupied with what I had heard and what it might mean. When I arrived at my home, I went through the motions of my evening routine with a kind of automaticity, preparing dinner and sitting down to eat, engaging in the various activities that structured my evening. But throughout these activities, I found myself acutely aware of a question that had been implanted in my consciousness by the radio broadcast. Was I actually experiencing these activities, or was I simply experiencing the memory of these activities, or some kind of echo of these activities that was being generated by a consciousness that was no longer connected to physical reality? I attempted to contact the radio station the next morning, attempting to find some kind of explanation for what had been broadcast the day before. I called the station and spoke with a receptionist who seemed confused by my inquiry. She insisted that the station had no record of the broadcast I was describing, that no message of that nature could have been transmitted through their signal, that I must have been listening to a different station, or that I must be misremembering what I had heard. Her dismissal of my account, while perhaps reasonable from her perspective, only served to deepen my sense of confusion and disorientation about what had occurred. Over the following days, I found myself preoccupied with questions about the nature of death and the nature of consciousness. I began to examine my own life with a kind of scrutiny that I had not brought to it before, attempting to identify any evidence that might support the claim that I had actually died, and that what I was experiencing was a kind of post-mortem continuation of consciousness. I looked for inconsistencies in my memories, for gaps in my understanding of my own biography, for anything that might suggest that I had experienced a fatal event that I had forgotten or that I had been unable to acknowledge. What I began to discover through this process of examination was that my memories of my life were not as coherent and as continuous as I had previously assumed them to be. There were gaps in my recollection, periods of time that seemed to be missing or unclear in my memory. There were significant life events that I could remember in terms of their outcomes, but that I could not clearly remember the process of experiencing. Most disturbingly, I began to notice that there seemed to be a kind of discontinuity in my consciousness. Moments in which the stream of consciousness that I was experiencing seemed to shift or jump in ways that were difficult to account for. The more I examined my own consciousness and my own memories, the more the possibility that I was actually dead, that my consciousness was continuing in some kind of post-mortem state, began to seem less like a disturbing delusion and more like a plausible explanation for various aspects of my experience that had always seemed somewhat odd or unusual, but that I had never quite articulated or examined carefully. I began to consider the possibility that the ordinary waking life that I had always taken for granted as the fundamental reality of my existence might actually be something quite different from what I had assumed, that it might be a kind of dream or a kind of hallucination generated by a consciousness that was no longer connected to physical reality. I became increasingly isolated in the days following the radio broadcast, finding it difficult to engage in ordinary social interaction with a sense of authenticity and presence. When I was at work, I found myself observing my own behavior as though from a distance, watching myself perform the role of a functioning member of society while feeling fundamentally disconnected from the activities I was engaged in. When I interacted with family members and friends, I found myself acutely aware of the possibility that these were not actually other conscious beings, but were instead manifestations of my own consciousness, projections of my own mind that I was engaging with in a kind of solipsistic drama. This realization produced in me a kind of existential crisis. If I was indeed dead, if my consciousness was continuing in some kind of post-mortem state, then what was the significance of anything that I did? If the world around me was a projection of my own consciousness, a kind of dream or hallucination generated by a mind that was no longer connected to physical reality, then did anything that I did have any actual consequence or significance? If the people I loved were not actually other conscious beings, but were instead manifestations of my own mind, then what did my love for them actually mean? I found myself unable to function adequately in the ordinary world, unable to maintain the facade of normalcy that is required to function in society. I took a leave of absence from my work, telling my supervisor that I was experiencing some kind of personal crisis that required my attention. I spent increasing amounts of time alone, attempting to investigate the question of whether I was actually dead and whether my consciousness was continuing in some kind of post-mortem state. I engaged in various kinds of meditation and introspection, attempting to penetrate the veil of ordinary consciousness to discover what lay beneath it, attempting to find evidence of my own death or to understand the mechanism by which my consciousness was continuing after death. It was during this period of intense introspection and questioning that I began to develop a theory about what had actually happened to me and what the radio broadcast had actually represented. What if the broadcast had not been an external communication from some kind of supernatural or transcendent source, but had instead been a communication from a deeper level of my own consciousness, a level of consciousness that had access to truth about my actual situation, that my ordinary waking consciousness did not have access to? What if the radio itself had not been broadcasting the message, but had instead been functioning as a kind of amplifier or a kind of translator that allowed a message from a deeper level of consciousness to be perceived by my ordinary waking awareness? According to this theory, what the deeper level of my consciousness had been trying to communicate was not necessarily that my physical body had actually died in the conventional sense, but that some fundamental aspect of my consciousness had died, that some capacity or dimension of my being that was essential to authentic life had ceased to function or had been abandoned. The death that the radio had been announcing might not be a literal physical death, but rather a kind of spiritual or psychological death, a death of the authentic self, a kind of living death that resulted from the adoption of inauthentic patterns of existence and the abandonment of genuine engagement with the world and with other people. With this realization, the entire significance of the message shifted. What the radio had been trying to communicate was not that I was experiencing a supernatural post-mortem continuation of consciousness, but that I was living a kind of life in death, a kind of existence in which the essential spark of authentic being had been extinguished, and what remained was simply a mechanical continuation of the patterns and routines that I had adopted. The death that had occurred was not the death of the physical body, but the death of authentic consciousness, the death of genuine engagement and presence, and the replacement of authentic being with a kind of automaticity and inauthenticity. This understanding produced in me a profound shift in how I understood my situation and what I needed to do in response to it. If what the radio had been communicating was accurate, if I was indeed in a state of living death characterized by the abandonment of authentic consciousness and authentic engagement, then the appropriate response was not to attempt to discover the mechanism by which my consciousness was continuing after physical death, but rather to awaken from the kind of death in life that I had been experiencing and to begin to live in a more authentic and more conscious way. I began to examine the patterns of my life, the habits and routines that structured my existence, the ways that I had adopted inauthentic modes of being in service of various goals and expectations. I recognized how much of my life had been organized around the pursuit of things that I did not genuinely care about, how much of my energy and attention had been directed toward maintaining a kind of social performance that did not reflect my actual values and desires. I recognized how I had gradually allowed authentic engagement with the world and with other people to fade away, replacing it with a kind of mechanical performance of the roles that society had assigned to me. The realization of this kind of living death, while initially disturbing, began to open up the possibility of genuine transformation. If I was indeed dead in the sense of having abandoned authentic consciousness and authentic engagement, then it was possible for me to come back to life, to awaken from the kind of death in life that I had been experiencing, to begin to live in a more conscious and more authentic way. The radio had delivered a message of death, but the message had the potential to be the beginning of a new kind of life, a life characterized by consciousness and authenticity rather than by automaticity and performance. I began to make changes in my life designed to awaken from the death in life that I had been experiencing. I left my job, recognizing that it had been organized around goals that were not genuinely mine and that did not reflect my authentic values and desires. I ended relationships that had been organized around patterns of inauthenticity and performance, recognizing that they could not be transformed into genuine connections while I was in a state of living death. I moved away from the environment that had structured my existence and attempted to create new circumstances that would support a more conscious and more authentic way of living. These changes were dramatic and disruptive, and they created considerable difficulty and suffering for myself and for the people who had been part of my life before the transformation began. But alongside the difficulty came a sense of awakening, a sense that I was beginning to emerge from a kind of death and to reconnect with dimensions of existence and consciousness that I had forgotten I had access to. Colors seemed brighter, sounds seemed richer, interactions with other people began to carry more genuine presence and more authentic engagement. What began to emerge through this process of awakening was a recognition that the radio broadcast had not been lying to me, had not been deceiving me about my situation. In a very real sense, I had indeed been dead in the sense of having abandoned authentic consciousness and authentic engagement with the world. What the radio had done was to make this death visible to me, to communicate in terms that I could not ignore or rationalize away the reality of the state I had been in. But more importantly, what emerged was a recognition that death and life were not absolute categories, that the boundary between them was more permeable and more subtle than I had previously understood. What I had discovered through the experience of the radio broadcast and through the transformation that followed was that it was possible to be alive while being dead, to continue to exist as a physical being while one's consciousness had effectively ceased to function in authentic ways. It was also possible to awaken from this kind of living death, to reconnect with the dimensions of consciousness and existence that made life worth living, to begin to experience genuine presence and genuine engagement. As months and years passed following the radio broadcast, I found myself developing a different relationship with the question of death. The broadcast had initially terrified me because it had seemed to suggest that my physical existence had already ended, that I was experiencing some kind of supernatural continuation of consciousness without a physical substrate. But the deeper meaning of the broadcast, the meaning that gradually revealed itself as I underwent the transformation that it catalyzed, was something quite different. The radio had been communicating that the kind of death that mattered most was not the death of the physical body, but the death of authentic consciousness, the death of genuine engagement with existence. It had been communicating that I had died in this sense, that I had allowed the authentic dimensions of my consciousness to fade away and to be replaced by patterns of automaticity and inauthenticity. And it had been offering me the possibility of awakening from this kind of death, of reconnecting with authentic consciousness, of beginning to live again in a way that mattered. What I came to understand through sustained reflection on the experience was that the radio broadcast was not unique to me, that it represented a kind of message that might be relevant to many people in contemporary society, a message about the kind of living death that characterizes much of modern existence. In a world organized around the pursuit of economic security and social status, in a world in which people are encouraged to adopt inauthentic roles and to abandon authentic engagement with the world and with each other, a kind of living death becomes the default condition of existence for many people. The radio had offered me a wake-up call, a dramatic and undeniable communication about the state I was in, a communication that could not be ignored or rationalized away or integrated into the existing patterns of my life. The fact that the message had been delivered through the medium of the radio, through a technology that was part of the very infrastructure of the ordinary world in which I had been living, seemed significant. The message had penetrated the veil of ordinary consciousness through a medium that was ordinarily used for the transmission of entertainment and distraction, suggesting that consciousness could break through even the most thoroughly controlled and most thoroughly commodified spaces of modern existence. As I continued to live in the years following the radio broadcast, I found myself in car, easingly aware of moments in which I could feel the presence of that kind of living death attempting to establish itself again, moments in which the patterns of inauthenticity and automaticity that I had struggled to transcend seemed to be trying to reassert themselves. The constant pressure of social expectation, the constant demand to perform roles and to maintain facades, the constant temptation to abandon authentic engagement in favor of security and comfort, all of these forces continued to operate, continued to invite me back into the kind of living death from which I had awakened. But the memory of the radio broadcast, the memory of hearing that stark and undeniable message that I was already dead, remained with me as a kind of touchstone, a way of returning to consciousness when I found myself drifting back into automaticity and inauthenticity. The message had planted something in my consciousness, something that could not be removed or forgotten, something that continued to call me back toward authenticity and presence and genuine engagement with existence. What the radio had revealed to me was that death was not something that happened only at the end of physical life, that death was something that could occur in the midst of physical existence if one allowed the authentic dimensions of consciousness to fade away and to be replaced by patterns of mere existence without genuine being. But the radio had also revealed that it was possible to awaken from this kind of death, to reconnect with authentic consciousness, to begin to live again in the midst of a world that constantly seemed to invite people into patterns of living death. The radio said I was already dead, and in a very real sense, I had indeed been dead. I had been living without authentic consciousness, without genuine engagement, without presence. But the message that had come through the radio dial, delivered in a form that could not be ignored or rationalized away, had offered me the possibility of resurrection, the possibility of awakening from the kind of death in life that I had been experiencing and of beginning to live in a way that actually felt like living. Years have passed since that afternoon when I heard the radio broadcast, years in which I have attempted to maintain the consciousness and the authenticity that began to emerge after receiving the message. The struggle continues, the pressure to drift back into patterns of inauthenticity and automaticity continues to operate, but the knowledge that I had once been dead, that I had experienced a kind of living death and had begun to awaken from it, remains with me. It serves as a constant reminder that authentic life is possible, that consciousness and presence and genuine engagement are within reach if I am willing to face the difficult truths about the state I find myself in and to undergo the transformation that becoming truly alive requires. The radio said I was already dead, and though I did not understand what it meant at first, I have come to recognize that the message was one of the most important communications I have ever received, a message that called me from a kind of death back toward life, from inauthenticity toward authenticity, from the abandonment of genuine consciousness toward the awakening and cultivation of consciousness that is authentic and real. That message continues to resonate within me, continues to guide my attempts to live in a way that honors the reality of what it means to be truly alive, rather than simply continuing to exist as though alive while actually being dead. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The radio said I was already dead, continued, as I continued to live with the understanding that had emerged from the radio broadcast, as I adjusted to a way of being that was more conscious and more authentic than the way I had been living before, I began to notice something that at first seemed subtle, but that gradually became impossible to ignore. I began to see the same kind of living death that I had experienced, the same patterns of automaticity and inauthenticity that had characterized my own existence, manifesting in the people around me in ways that seemed increasingly obvious once I had been made aware of them. My family members seemed to be moving through their lives in a kind of automaticity, performing roles and engaging in routines that did not seem to reflect their authentic desires or their genuine values. My former friends, the people with whom I had maintained relationships based on habit and social convention, seemed to be caught in patterns of existence that resembled my own previous condition, existing without genuine presence or authentic engagement. Colleagues from my previous employment seemed to be spending their days in service of goals that seemed hollow and empty, when examined from the perspective of genuine human meaning and purpose. What I had previously understood as the normal and ordinary patterns of human existence began to reveal itself to me as a kind of collective living death, a kind of arrangement of human society in which people were encouraged and in some cases forced to abandon authentic consciousness and authentic engagement in favor of the performance of roles and the pursuit of goals that did not reflect their genuine values or their genuine desires. The recognition of this pattern of collective living death produced in me a kind of grief, a recognition of the extent to which human consciousness and human potential was being suppressed and distorted by the structures and arrangements of modern society. What became increasingly clear to me was that the radio broadcast that I had experienced was not a random or isolated event, was not something that had happened to me uniquely because of circumstances specific to my own life. Instead, it seemed to be part of a larger pattern, a kind of collective attempt by consciousness itself, or by some dimension of reality that transcended individual consciousness, to wake human beings up to the reality of the living death that had become normalized and accepted as the ordinary condition of human existence. I began to pay attention to the stories and the accounts of other people, to listen carefully to what people were saying about their lives and their experiences. What I discovered through this careful listening was that many people seemed to be experiencing a kind of unease or dissatisfaction with their lives, a sense that something was fundamentally wrong even though they could not quite articulate what that something was. Many people seem to be experiencing moments of what I would have described as partial awakening, moments in which the automaticity and the inauthenticity of their ordinary lives became visible to them and produced a kind of discomfort or a kind of yearning for something else. Some people described moments of profound connection or genuine presence that had occurred in the midst of their otherwise automated lives, moments in which the ordinary patterns of inauthenticity seemed to fall away, and they had experienced something like authentic consciousness. Others described a kind of chronic dissatisfaction, or a kind of persistent sense that they were living the wrong life, that they were on the wrong path, that they were not being who they actually were meant to be. Still others described a kind of numbness, or a kind of emotional deadness that seemed to characterize much of their experience, a sense that they were going through the motions of living without actua, feeling alive. What all of these accounts seemed to share was an implicit recognition of the same truth that the radio had communicated to me, that it was possible to be alive while being dead, that the ordinary patterns of human existence in modern society seemed to involve a kind of death of authentic consciousness, a kind of abandonment of genuine engagement and genuine presence. What seemed to be missing from most of these accounts was a clear understanding of what had happened, a clear articulation of the distinction between authentic life and the kind of living death that had become normalized, and most importantly, a sense of how it might be possible to awaken from this kind of death and to reconnect with authentic consciousness. I found myself increasingly drawn to the possibility of attempting to communicate what I had learned through my own experience, to share the insight that had been given to me through the radio broadcast with other people, to attempt to help others understand what had happened to them and what might be possible if they could awaken from the kind of living death that seemed to be the default condition of contemporary existence. But I also found myself encountering significant resistance to this intention, discovering that the message about living death and the possibility of awakening was something that many people seemed unwilling or unable to receive. When I attempted to share what I had learned with people close to me, I often encountered skepticism or dismissal. People seemed to interpret my message as a kind of judgment of their lives, as an implicit criticism of the choices they had made and the paths they had followed. People seemed to experience my attempts to awaken them as a kind of threat, a threat to the stability and the security that their current arrangements provided, even though those arrangements seemed to involve the abandonment of authentic consciousness and authentic engagement. What I gradually came to understand was that the message about living death and the possibility of awakening was a message that people could only truly receive if they had already begun to sense, on some level, that something was wrong with their current mode of existence, if they had already begun to experience the kind of unease and the kind of yearning that seemed to characterize people who were beginning to awaken from living death. For people who were still deeply immersed in the patterns of automaticity and inauthenticity, the message could seem threatening rather than liberating, could seem like an attack on their way of being rather than an invitation to something better. This realization led me to a shift in how I approached the question of awakening others from living death. Rather than attempting to directly communicate the message and to convince people that they needed to awaken, I began to focus on attempting to embody the quality of consciousness that came from being more authentic and more present, to attempt to demonstrate through my own being and my own way of living what it was possible to experience when one had awakened from living death. I recognized that the most powerful teaching was not something that was transmitted through words, but something that was transmitted through presence, through the example of someone who was living in a more conscious and more authentic way. As I began to embody this quality of more authentic consciousness, as I began to live in ways that reflected genuine values and genuine engagement, I noticed that some people began to respond to this quality of presence in ways that went beyond ordinary social interaction. People seemed to sense something different about how I was being, seemed to be drawn to the quality of consciousness and presence that I was attempting to embody. Some people seem to experience this contact with a more conscious and more authentic way of being as a kind of awakening in themselves, a kind of triggering of their own capacity for authenticity and presence. What I was discovering through this process was that consciousness and authenticity seemed to have a kind of contagious quality, that people could catch a sense of what it was like to be more present and more authentic by being in the presence of someone who was living in that way. This suggested that the awakening from living death was not something that required dramatic external events like a radio broadcast, though such events could certainly serve as catalysts. Instead, the awakening seemed to be something that could occur through more subtle forms of contact and exposure, through the simple act of encountering someone who was living in a more conscious and more authentic way. As I continued to explore this understanding, I began to reflect more deeply on the nature of the radio broadcast and what it had actually represented. What if the radio broadcast had not been something external to me, but had instead been a kind of manifestation of my own consciousness? A way that consciousness at a deeper level had found to communicate with the more ordinary level of consciousness that I was ordinarily aware of. What if the radio had been a vehicle through which a deeper dimension of consciousness could break through the patterns of automaticity and inauthenticity that were obscuring authentic awareness? This reflection led me to a recognition that every human being probably had access to some kind of internal communication channel through which deeper dimensions of consciousness could attempt to break through the patterns of automaticity that ordinarily dominated experience. For some people, this communication might come through dreams, THR, of moments of intuition, through sudden insights or realizations that seem to come from nowhere. For others, it might come through artistic inspiration, through moments of genuine connection with another person, through experiences of beauty or of transcendence that seem to temporarily lift the veil of ordinary consciousness. What the radio broadcast had been for me was one particular form through which this communication could occur, one particular way that deeper dimensions of consciousness had found to reach me and to awaken me to the reality of the living death in which I had been existing. The fact that the message had come through the medium of the radio, through a piece of technology that was ordinarily used for the transmission of commercial and entertainment content, seemed significant. It suggested that consciousness could break through even the most thoroughly commodified and the most thoroughly controlled spaces of modern existence, that there was no medium or no technology that was so thoroughly corrupted that consciousness could not use it to awaken human beings to the reality of their situation. As I continued to live in the years following the radio broadcast, I found myself becoming increasingly interested in the question of what the actual mechanism of death was. What exactly was happening when human consciousness fell into the kind of living death that seemed to be the default condition of contemporary existence? What was it that caused consciousness to become automated and inauthentic? What was it that caused people to abandon genuine engagement and genuine presence in favor of the performance of roles and the pursuit of goals that did not reflect their authentic values? What I came to understand through reflection and through observation of the patterns in other people and in society was that the living death seemed to occur gradually, through a process of incremental capitulation to the demands and the expectations of society. It began early in childhood, when children were taught to suppress their authentic desires and their authentic expressions in favor of behaviors that would make them acceptable to the adults around them. It continued through the educational system, which seemed designed more to produce compliant and obedient citizens than to nurture authentic consciousness and genuine engagement with learning. And it continued throughout adult life, through the various structures and systems of society that seemed designed to keep people trapped in patterns of inauthenticity and automaticity. The workplace demanded that people perform roles that did not reflect their authentic selves, demanded that they pursue goals determined by others rather than goals that reflected their genuine values. The consumer economy demanded that people constantly pursue the acquisition of goods and experiences, creating a kind of perpetual dissatisfaction that kept consciousness occupied and prevented authentic engagement with the present moment. The entertainment and media systems provided constant distraction and stimulation, designed to keep consciousness occupied with content that was not of their own creation, preventing them from accessing the deeper dimensions of consciousness through which authentic engagement with existence could occur. All of these systems and structures seemed designed, whether intentionally or through the simple momentum of their own logic, to prevent human beings from achieving the kind of consciousness and authenticity that seemed to be necessary for genuine living. The living death was not something that happened to people through some kind of external force, was not something that was imposed upon them against their will. Instead, it was something that people seemed to gradually accept. and even to embrace, something that they collaborated in creating through their own choices and their own surrenders to the demands and the expectations of the systems and structures in which they lived. This realization produced in me a recognition that the problem of living death was not something that could be solved simply through individual transformation, though individual transformation was certainly necessary. The problem of living death was embedded in the very structures and systems of society, in the ways that human society had been organized to prioritize efficiency and productivity and the accumulation of capital over consciousness and authenticity and genuine human flourishing. As long as these structures and systems remained in place, as long as society continued to be organized in ways that demanded and encouraged the abandonment of authentic consciousness, the default condition of human existence would continue to be a kind of living death, and only those individuals who were willing to undergo significant personal transformation, who were willing to resist the demands and the expectations of the dominant systems and structures, would be able to awaken to something approaching authentic consciousness. This understanding led me toward a recognition that the answer to the problem of living death could not be simply individual, but would need to be collective, would need to involve the transformation of the structures and systems of society themselves. It would need to involve the development of alternative ways of organizing human life that could support consciousness and authenticity rather than suppressing and fragmenting them. It would need to involve the creation of communities and institutions that could serve the development of consciousness and the cultivation of authentic human engagement rather than the pursuit of profit and the maintenance of social control. I found myself increasingly drawn toward the possibility of participating in the creation of such alternatives, of working toward the development of communities and systems that could support a more conscious and more authentic way of living. What I discovered through this engagement was that there seemed to be a growing number of people who were beginning to sense, on some level, that something was fundamentally wrong with the dominant systems and structures of contemporary society. People who were beginning to awaken from the kind of living death that had become normalized. These people seemed to be drawn together, seemed to be finding ways to create spaces and communities in which a more conscious and more authentic way of living could be supported and cultivated. What I observed in these emerging communities and alternative structures was a kind of tentative rekindling of consciousness, a kind of beginning of awakening from the kind of living death that had seemed total and inescapable within the dominant systems and structures of society. But what I also began to notice was that the process of awakening and of creating alternative structures was complicated and difficult, that the patterns of living death were so deeply embedded in consciousness and in society that awakening was a gradual and ongoing process rather than a sudden transformation. People who awakened would find themselves continually pulled back toward the patterns and the comforts of living death, continually tempted by the security and the familiarity that those patterns offered. The communities and the alternative structures that people created would often begin to reproduce some of the same patterns of domination and control that they had been attempting to escape. What this suggested to me was that the process of awakening from living death, both individually and collectively, as not something that could be completed, but was instead something that required constant vigilance and constant effort, a perpetual practice of choosing authenticity and consciousness in the face of forces that seemed constantly to invite people back into patterns of automaticity and inauthenticity. The radio had said that I was already dead, and through the years that had followed that communication, I had come to understand increasingly deeply what that meant. The death that the radio had been announcing was not simply the death of an individual consciousness, but was the death of consciousness itself in contemporary society. The way that consciousness had been systematized out of ordinary human existence, replaced by patterns of automaticity and inauthenticity. The radio had been announcing not only my individual death, but a collective death, a death that had become so normalized and so accepted that most people no longer even recognized it as death. But the radio had also offered, implicitly, the possibility of resurrection, the possibility of awakening from this kind of death and of reconnecting with consciousness and authenticity. This possibility seemed to be calling forth responses in more and more people, seemed to be catalyzing a kind of collective awakening that was beginning to emerge in the midst of the structures and systems that had seemed designed to prevent such awakening. What became clear to me through sustained engagement with these questions was that the journey from living death to authentic life was not something that followed a linear path, was not something that could be completed once and then left behind. Instead, it seemed to be a spiral in which one would gradually develop deeper levels of consciousness and authenticity, would encounter new layers of automaticity and inauthenticity, would awaken from those layers and move deeper into consciousness, would then encounter new layers of deeper attachment to patterns of living death that required further awakening and further transformation. Each layer of awakening revealed new dimensions of the living death that had become normalized, new ways that consciousness had been fragmented and distorted by the structures and systems of society, and each layer of awakening required new efforts, new practices, new forms of discipline and intention to maintain consciousness and authenticity in the face of forces that constantly seemed to invite retreat back into automaticity and inauthenticity. I began to see that the radio broadcast that I had experienced, while it had come to me as a kind of shock and a kind of rupture of ordinary consciousness, was not unique or unusual, but was part of a larger pattern of consciousness attempting to break through the barriers of automaticity that had been constructed in individual minds and in collective society. The broadcasts seemed to be occurring constantly, in subtle and not so subtle ways, reaching people through the media and the systems through which they ordinarily encountered information, breaking through at moments of vulnerability or openness, offering the stark and undeniable message that something fundamental about human existence had died, and that the possibility of resurrection and awakening remained available. What the radio had communicated to me in its direct and unambiguous way was that I had been living in a kind of death, had been moving through life without genuine consciousness or authentic engagement. But more importantly, the radio had communicated that this condition could be recognized and named, that it could be acknowledged, that there was the possibility of awakening from it. The fact that the message had come through the medium of the radio, through a device that was part of the ordinary infrastructure of my life, suggested that the awakening was not something that required me to escape from the world or to transcend the ordinary structures of existence, but rather something that required me to become more conscious and more authentic within the world as it actually was. As I continued to live in the years following the radio broadcast, I found myself returning again and again to the recognition that had emerged from that initial experience, that the truly important dimension of human existence was not the continuation of physical life, but the development and the cultivation of consciousness. That authentic life could only emerge through the awakening of consciousness and the commitment to authentic engagement with existence. The radio had announced that I was already dead, and in awakening to what that meant, I had begun to truly live. The message that the radio had delivered continued to resonate through my experience, continued to serve as a reminder that consciousness was always available, that awakening was always possible, that the journey from living death to authentic life was a journey that could be undertaken at any moment in response to the call of consciousness breaking through the barriers of automaticity. And the recognition that this call was reaching not only me but many other people, that there was a kind of collective awakening beginning to emerge in the midst of systems and structures that had seemed designed to prevent such awakening, offered a sense of hope that despite the vastness of the challenge and the depth of the automation and the inauthenticity that had become normalized in contemporary existence, it might still be possible for human consciousness to awaken, for authentic life to emerge, for genuine engagement with existence to become possible once again at both individual and collective levels. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.